It was New Year's Eve, and to make a change to a crappy year, myself and a bunch of friends talked about going camping up in the Rocky Mountains to go into the new year with a bang. Joe had the job of carrying as much alcohol as he humanly could manage. Fred had the job of carrying as many fireworks, and myself had the job of carrying all the accessories, as well as the tent and other bits and bobs. Not sure who had the worst job. Probably Joe with all the alcohol. But thankfully, my mum gave us a lift close to the hiking trail and set off pretty swiftly. Fred was the only one who hadn't been up into the Rocky Mountains before, so for him, he was loving every second of it. Whilst Joe and I marched on to a campsite we heard other people talk about. It was a great location, overlooking some staggering views. We set up our tent, broke the beer out, and laughed and joked, whilst of course happily forgetting about the year we had all experienced. When night arrived, it was the perfect time to set off the fireworks. Our first one went awry and darted into some nearby trees. Thankfully, nothing caught on fire, and it was a sharp lesson in not what to do. After we reached about halfway into what we had brought with us, Joe taps me on the shoulder and asks if I can hear anything. Of course, I didn't hear anything. I was tipsy, laughing, and wanting to see more fireworks. So we cracked on. Another two goes up, and then I hear snap twigs. It was only brief, but it made me stop and look back. Joe clocked me looking back and came over, sitting beside me saying he could hear it too. We were sure Fred didn't hear anything, and we knew he was the most anxious person out of us three, so we agreed to shrug her off, finish the fireworks, and then jump back into our tent. This time, we rushed through the rest of the fireworks before we told Fred we should head to bed, as we had a surprise for him in the morning, and he needed to get some sleep. It was a blatant lie, but we did anything to get him into the tent. Things fell silent. No sound was heard, apart from the typical noises from nature itself. And I began to shut my eyes, and I heard someone whistling. Fred shot up, panicked by the sound. We told him it was an animal, and it's nothing to worry about. Not sure if he believed us, but it didn't matter, as the whistling turned into a shadow walking past our tent. And I put my finger to my lips for Fred to follow suit, and we just listened. They seemed to be rummaging through the stuff we had before they knelt down at the entrance to our tent. We watched as they reached down and grabbed hold of the zip, and then he froze. No idea why, but he then let go, stood up, started whistling, and walked back off. We stayed awake all night and didn't leave until the morning. The man had vanished, and there was definitely one way to start the new year. It was the night before New Year's Eve, and I was around my friends. We were discussing plans for the next day. So far, all we knew was that we were going to get drunk. Typical, I know. But then Ash suggested to us that one of his mates were throwing an insane party for New Year's, and we should attend. From what he was describing, it sounded great, even if none of us actually knew Ash all that well. Without really thinking too much into what we had agreed to, the night of the party had arrived, and we all headed on over to the stranger's house. To be fair, when we arrived, the place was thriving. Cars filled the street and a few side streets. People were everywhere, and thankfully he lived not too close to other houses, so the music was blaring. It certainly got us in the mood to party. Somehow, Ash spots us as we walk on up to the house, and he welcomes us, giving a bow whilst holding a few beers, and marched us on inside. It was a typical house party you can imagine. everybody dancing, some making out, others diving in the pool. Nothing out of the ordinary. We all stuck together at first, drinking away and having a good time. My 2 friends went off with 2 guys they had met there, and I was left on my own, being that awkward person in the corner, not exactly talking to anyone, but not exactly shy either. I was about to go out by the pool, as things seemed to be a lot more fun and wilder, when Ash steps into my view, cutting me to a halt. He starts talking about some drug everybody was taking, and if I wanted to be a part of the party, I should take it too. I asked what it was, but he wouldn't say. All I can tell you is that it looked diamond shaped and was blue. I wasn't a big pill taker anyway, and the size of this one in his hand was too big for me, so I politely refused. Weirdly, he tried pushing it on me, and again I told him no before pushing past him and sitting out by the pool. That's when a girl came over and sat next to me, passing me over a beer, and we started chatting about how our night was going. I took a sip and made small talk, but she seemed very interested in my night, really wanting me to have the best time possible. Maybe it was just her being polite, but my mind quickly went elsewhere as I started feeling funny. I'm not a doctor, but I knew I didn't feel right. I got up, knocking over my drink, to which people cheered, and headed on back inside to look for my friends. I soon began to feel dizzy as I reached for my phone and called for my dad. I don't remember what happened next, as I must have blacked out, but till when I awoke, I was back at my home and my friends were there too with their parents. From what my dad was saying, I had told him to come and get me immediately, as I had been drugged, and then blacked out. Find My iPhone was enabled, so he was able to find the house. When he rushed inside, he found a very skinny guy with long hair, caressing my body and hair. My dad had ripped him off and chucked him to the other side of the room. My friends hadn't been drugged, but had calmed down when they heard all the commotion. It was Ash who was the one being creepy and disturbing. Don't know if the girl was in on it, but it was a night I will never be forgetting. My dad told me the story when he was young, and what he classes as wild before he met my mum. So, my dad liked moving around a lot, travelling, seeing the world. And there were massive fireworks display a good 30 miles away in Washington. Not having a car and living in what he still classes as the free life, my dad had to go hitchhiking. One by one, every car just drove on by. Not that he blamed any of them. He was a single man, with not much in terms of valuables, in the middle of the night, walking down a long road that was covered with trees. Thankfully, after walking what must have been a few miles, and his feet now barking with pain, an old-looking Chevy pulled up. It creaked to a halt as the man leaned on over and widened down his window. After talking for a little while, the man offered a ride and said he too was heading to Washington for work, so it was fine to tag along. First thing my dad had noticed was the car itself. The mess in the Chevy was disgusting. Junk wrappers and papers were crumbled up and just flung everywhere. The man, who introduced himself as Bobby, wore a trucker's hat, a dirty shirt, and had a long beard. He looked like he worked a hell of a lot and could do with a good night's rest and some relaxation. My dad joked about it, but Bobby didn't take too kindly to what he was saying. Apparently, the mood had shifted from being all friendly and fun to really Bobby asking a lot of questions as to where exactly in Washington did my dad want to go, and why so late, etc. He replied with only vague answers, only wanting the lift, and that was it. And the tension was getting real, and the signpost they had just passed said it was going to be another 15 miles before they reached their destination. Thankfully, things fell silent, and as my dad looked out of the front window, Really thinking about getting out and walking, Bobby slapped his hand down onto my dad's leg and squeezed it, as if he wanted to have some fun. Of course, it was an instant decline, but apparently Bobby didn't mean that kind of fun. My dad watched as he reached down into his door panel and pulled out a gun. Apparently, it was like watching it in slow motion, as a fight quickly broke out and the gun was shot once or twice. Thankfully, it hadn't hit anyone, but the Chevy ended up swaying off-road and came to a halt as Bobby smacked his head onto the dashboard and knocked himself unconscious. My dad, more whiplashed than anything, grabbed hold of the gun and ran from the Chevy. He ran and ran for as long as his body would allow him to. He kept the gun on him for a while and made it to the fireworks display after another car had picked him up, and it was now a family who did turn out to be really nice people. What happened to the gun and Bobby? Well, my dad says he dumped the gun into a lake and has no idea what happened to Bobby. This was back in the 80s. Admittedly, one of my most favourite times I have ever lived in. So you can probably guess I am older than most people who usually tell these stories. I was young back then, somewhere around the age of 15, where getting up to no good was a normal thing. A few friends of mine had all suggested going to the mall and playing on the arcades. I was more than happy to do that. It was classed as the cool thing to do. Well, around my friends it was anyway. I found myself the happiest there too. Being New Year's Eve, my mum was always reluctant to let me go anyway, as it was a family tradition to go to the local fireworks display to celebrate and see into the new year the right way. I won't lie, I secretly loved going to the fireworks display, even if I never truly expressed it when I was with them. But as I rushed on out the front door, I told my mum I would be there and I wouldn't miss it, slamming the door shut. The arcades were always busy, but you always could find a game to play and have fun with, even if it meant having all your friends around watching you. The night was incredible, even if my friends and I spotted some homeless man staring at us from afar. And by that, we meant he was in the mall, just sitting down and watching us as we were close to the entrance. All that was on my mind was to beat whoever Johnny 187 was at the top of the scoreboard. Next thing I know, fully engrossed in the game and almost about to win, this homeless man had come over and asked to play and join in. It completely surprised me, sending me into a defeat and missing out on the top spot. Could not believe my luck. We all just talked amongst ourselves. I was telling the man he could play now, as it was technically time to go to the fireworks display anyway. So where does this story get scary, you may be asking? Well, we arrived at the fireworks display a little bit early and decided to just stand around and wait. One by one, all my friends went off with their families, and I was left waiting for mine. My mum's friends all didn't want to leave me by myself, but they knew how organised and on time my mum was, so I wasn't going to be alone for too long. But it only takes a few minutes for something to go wrong, doesn't it? As I sat on what I presumed to be a public bench, I had a feeling someone was behind me, but before I could turn around, I was grabbed, yanked from my seat, and was carried away. How nobody saw baffles me even to this day. I was kicking around and trying my best to get free. They had their hand around my mouth and nose as he rushed me back to the van, where he chucked me inside and shut the door. The door handle was broken inside, so it could only be opened from the outside. I noticed that it was the homeless man from earlier, except he wasn't homeless. He just looked rough. I pleaded with him to let me go when I started receiving calls from my mum. I rushed to pick it up and managed to tell her someone grabbed me and put me in a van, before this man grabbed it off me and hung up. He leaned over me in the back and said if I tried anything like that again, I would never see the light of day. He slammed the back door shut, and I hear a fight break out right next to the van. It sounded intense, whatever was happening. The back door swung open again, and it was my older brother. I rushed to give him a hug, and he said for us to go now. I looked back to see the man on the ground, unconscious. The police were called, and the man was taken in, but didn't care too much to wonder what became of him. Back at the fireworks display, with my mum wrapping herself around me, literally not letting me go anywhere, I asked my brother how he managed to find me. He said it was just pure luck. He was driving past and noticed this man didn't look right, and something just didn't feel good. He got out of his car to ask if the man was okay, but instead he heard me cry in the back, and that's when he knew what was going on. I had nightmares for some time after that night. I was wondering what could have been.